The early morning mist clung to the edges of the Tunisian desert, turning the sand into a hazy gold. Beneath that strange African light, German Panzer crews lounged beside their tanks. Lean, sunburned men with the casual arrogance of soldiers who had seen victory after victory. Their panzers, with angular armor and dark crosses on the side, stood like predators resting after a hunt. Word had spread through the camp. The Americans had arrived. Fresh troops, new tanks, new uniforms, and naive confidence. The Germans grinned. To them, the Americans were latecomers to a war that had already devoured the best of Europe. What could these untested men in olive drab possibly bring to the battlefield that Rommel's Afrika Korps hadn't already crushed? One of the Panzer commanders, Feldwebel Karl Weiss, spat into the sand and nodded toward the horizon. "They call it the Sherman," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Another box on tracks. We'll turn it into scrap before breakfast," his loader Otto laughed. "If it's anything like their coffee, it'll break before it gets hot." Nearby, other crews joined in, tossing jokes across the dusty clearing. They'd heard rumors of the new American tank, the M4 Sherman, but dismissed it as another lightweight design, a poor imitation of German engineering. The Panther and Tiger were their pride, symbols of mechanical superiority and battlefield dominance. The idea that an American tank could match them was absurd. The next day, they met the Shermans for the first time. It was near Kasserine Pass, a rugged stretch of Tunisian hills and sand-choked valleys. The air shimmered with heat and diesel fumes. The Americans moved in columns, green and nervous, their engines humming with mechanical youth. Inside one of the lead tanks sat Sergeant David Miller, a 24-year-old from Kansas who had never seen combat before. His hands trembled slightly on the turret's control handles as he scanned the horizon through the periscope. "Feels too quiet," he muttered. His gunner, Private Lucas, wiped sweat from his brow. "Maybe they're scared of us." Miller gave a short laugh, but he didn't believe it. They'd heard about the German tanks, how their shells punched through Allied armor like paper. Still, the Sherman was supposed to be reliable, fast, and easy to repair. The mechanics had praised it endlessly before the deployment. But none of that mattered when you could almost feel enemy eyes watching from the ridges. Then came the first shot. A Panzer IV hidden behind a low ridge fired at 800 meters. The German shell struck the lead Sherman square on the glacis plate, sending a thunderous explosion of sparks and smoke into the air. The tank lurched to a stop, its crew thrown into chaos. Flames burst from the engine compartment, a terrifying orange blossom that painted the sand in horror. "Hit! Direct hit!" Karl Weiss shouted from his Panzer. "See? Tin boxes!" His loader slammed another shell into the breach, and Weiss fired again. The second Sherman exploded in a shower of debris, its turret ripped clean off. Across the line, more German guns opened up. The Americans scrambled for cover, their formation breaking apart under the sudden, precise onslaught. Inside Miller's Sherman, the world became a furnace. A shell had grazed their side, punching a jagged hole through the armor. "Reverse! Reverse!" he shouted. But the driver was frozen, eyes wide. Miller grabbed him by the shoulder and screamed again. The engine roared to life, and they backed behind a low dune, heartbeats hammering in their ears. "Loader! AP shell! Now!" Miller ordered. Lucas shoved a 75mm round into the gun. The barrel swung toward a Panzer moving across the ridge. Miller aimed, steadied his breath, and fired. The shell hit the German tank's side armor, leaving only a dent. The Panzer rotated its turret in reply. "Back! Get us back!" Miller yelled. The Panzer fired, and missed by a fraction. Sand exploded around them. Miller's crew fired again, this time aiming for the track. The shot landed true. The Panzer halted, smoke rising from its right side. Miller felt a surge of hope, but the moment was short-lived. Another German round struck their rear plate, and the Sherman shuddered violently. "Bail out!" someone screamed. The hatch flew open, and the crew scrambled into the open desert, gasping for air. Behind them, their tank burned. The Germans advanced methodically, confident and precise. From the air, it looked like a hunt. Wolves moving in formation, cutting through inexperienced prey. By nightfall, dozens of Shermans lay smoldering across the valley floor, their tracks half buried in ash and sand. In the German camp that evening, laughter filled the air again. Weiss and his crew toasted with tin mugs. "To the Americans," he said mockingly, "and their fine new tanks." The men roared with amusement. But deep down, Weiss felt something else. Curiosity. For all their weakness, the Shermans had come fast and in numbers. Even after losing several tanks, the Americans had tried to regroup, returning fire with a determination that felt unsettling. A few miles away, Miller sat beside a wrecked Sherman, its blackened hull glowing faintly in the moonlight. Around him, other survivors rested silently, faces streaked with soot and disbelief. The sound of crickets filled the empty desert. "What did we do wrong?" Lucas asked quietly. Miller stared at the ground. "We underestimated them," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant the Germans or their own training. He thought of the factory workers back home, the men and women building these tanks by the thousands, believing they were sending invincible machines to war. Out here, those dreams burned like the wrecks before him. But even in defeat, there was resolve. The next day, reinforcements would come. More Shermans, more crews. The Americans weren't retreating from this fight. They were learning. In Berlin, German officers read reports of the battle with satisfaction. One general scrawled a note in the margin. "The American tanks are poorly armored and inferior to our panzers. They will be no problem." It was the kind of overconfidence that history loves to punish. Back in Tunisia, under a sky filled with distant stars, the desert wind carried the smell of oil, smoke, and steel. The laughter of the German crews echoed faintly across the dunes, mingling with the crackling of dying fires. But somewhere in that same darkness, engines rumbled again. The sound of new Shermans arriving, fresh and determined. The war was far from over, and though few could sense it yet, the balance was already beginning to shift. The Sherman's strength wasn't in its armor or its gun. It was in what came next, in how it multiplied, adapted, and refused to stop coming. As dawn crept over the desert, Karl Weiss watched the horizon through his binoculars and frowned. More silhouettes were appearing, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. He lowered the glasses slowly, the morning sun glinting off the steel. "They're back," he murmured. Otto laughed nervously. "More targets for us?" Weiss didn't answer. For the first time, his smile faded. The laughter on the front lines was beginning to sound hollow. The sun over North Africa burned like a furnace, stripping the desert of color until everything shimmered in tones of gold and ash. Out across that endless expanse, the tanks of two empires prowled in search of each other. German steel against American resolve, both roaring with engines that echoed through the dunes like thunder rolling across a wasteland. By early 1943, the Americans had thrown their full weight into the North African campaign. The British had been fighting Rommel for years, their lines stretched thin by his cunning maneuvers and lightning strikes. Now, the U.S. Army, inexperienced but determined, was arriving with fresh supplies, new uniforms, and their much-debated tank, the M4 Sherman. Sergeant David Miller sat inside his new Sherman, the desert wind rattling the periscope glass. His previous tank, his first tank, lay in ruins miles behind him. The smell of burned oil still lingered in his mind, as did the screams of his first crew. But he was back, leading a new team of men through the same deadly sand. "Feels hotter every day," said Private Lucas, wiping sweat from his neck. "That's Africa," Miller replied. "If the Panzers don't kill you, the sun will." They were advancing toward the Mareth line, a series of fortifications built by the French and now occupied by German and Italian forces. Intelligence reports spoke of ambushes, minefields, and snipers waiting in the hills. But the men inside the Shermans kept going, their engines straining, treads grinding over hard-packed sand. Up ahead, the British desert rats coordinated the push, their Crusaders and Churchills kicking up plumes of dust. Over the radio, clipped British voices gave bearings, coordinates, and warnings. Miller adjusted his headset. The message was clear. Enemy armor sighted near El Getar. "All right, boys," he said, tightening his grip on the turret controls. "This is it." As they crested a low dune, the horizon erupted. The first German shells screamed overhead, exploding into pillars of dust and flame. The Shermans immediately fanned out, trying to avoid presenting a clustered target. Through his periscope, Miller saw them. Dark shapes moving in the distance, angular and precise. Panzers advancing in tight formation, sunlight flashing off their barrels. Rommel's men were veterans, efficient, disciplined, and utterly fearless. Their tanks, though fewer in number, struck like vipers. Every German shell that hit a Sherman left behind a bloom of fire and black smoke. The Americans fired back, their 75mm guns thundering in defiance. The sand shook with the chaos of battle. "Target at 11 o'clock, 700 meters, Miller shouted. Lucas loaded the shell. "A P round in." Miller lined up the shot and fired. The recoil slammed through the turret, shaking dust from the roof. The round struck a Panzer 3 square in the side, piercing the armor. The German tank erupted in smoke and flames. "Direct hit," Lucas yelled. Miller's heart pounded. The victory was brief. Another shell slammed into the sand just in front of them, sending shrapnel rattling against the hull. The shockwave nearly deafened them. "Driver, move!" Flank left. The Sherman lurched forward, sand kicking up behind it as it maneuvered for position. The battle had become a brutal dance, machines weaving through smoke and craters, each crew relying on instinct as much as training. Overhead, Allied fighter planes screamed across the sky, strafing German supply lines. But on the ground, it was still the tanks that decided the tempo. The Shermans, though outgunned, had a hidden advantage: reliability. When German tanks overheated or jammed in the fine desert dust, the Shermans kept running. When the Panzers ran low on fuel, the Americans simply refueled from endless convoys streaming in from the coast. But reliability couldn't stop fear. "Panther, 2 o'clock, shouted the gunner. Miller turned and froze for half a second. The German tank rolled into view, its silhouette larger, heavier, more menacing. Its 75mm high-velocity gun glinted under the sun, the kind that could tear through a Sherman front plate like paper. "Get behind the ridge," Miller barked. The Panther fired first. The round ripped past them, grazing the turret. Metal shrieked, sparks flew, and the smell of hot steel filled the cabin. The crew ducked instinctively. "Loader, heat round, now!" Lucas fumbled the shell into the breech. Miller aimed for the side of the Panther's turret, where the armor was weakest. He fired, but the shot glanced off, leaving only a scorch mark. The Panther turned its gun toward them again. Go! 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 The driver slammed the throttle. The Sherman jolted backward, bouncing over rocks and dunes. A second German round hit nearby, shaking the tank so hard that tools and empty casings rattled off the walls. "Sir, we can't take another hit like that." "I know," Miller snapped. "We'll draw him toward the British line. They've got 17-pounders waiting." For 10 agonizing minutes, they played cat and mouse across the desert. The Panther pursuing, the Sherman dodging, darting behind ridges, reversing, firing, fleeing again. Finally, a burst of radio chatter cut through the static. "This is Red Fox Battery. You've got him in the open. Hold your position." Miller slammed his fist against the side. "Hold steady!" The Panther appeared once more, turret turning, its barrel locking onto the Sherman. But before it could fire, a British anti-tank shell screamed from the flank and struck it dead center. The explosion tore through its hull, sending a plume of smoke into the sky. The German tank burned, its blackened shell collapsing in the heat. Cheers erupted over the radio. Miller exhaled, his body trembling from the adrenaline. "Guess they're not invincible after all," Lucas said softly. Miller didn't answer. He watched the smoke curling upward, knowing that for every German tank destroyed, there were more waiting somewhere ahead. Better ones, stronger ones. But something had changed. They weren't being hunted anymore. They were fighting back. By dusk, the battlefield was silent again. The desert was littered with wrecks. Shermans, Panzers, half-tracks, and jeeps all scorched and broken. The air stank of oil and death. Miller climbed out of his tank and surveyed the carnage. To the west, the British were still mopping up the last pockets of resistance. The Allied lines had held. Against Rommel's best, they had not been crushed. Nearby, an old British sergeant limped over, his face caked in dust. "Bloody good show out there," he said, nodding toward Miller's tank. "Didn't think your Yanks had it in you." Miller smiled faintly. "Neither did we." The man chuckled and handed him a cigarette. They stood together in the twilight, watching the wrecks burn across the horizon. In the German camp, Karl Weiss sat beside his own tank, writing a report by lantern light. He noted the rising number of Shermans appearing in every engagement. More than before, always more. He couldn't shake the image of their persistence. For every one destroyed, another rolled into the fight. "Sir," Otto said quietly, "do you think they'll ever run out of them?" Weiss didn't look up. "No," he said. "And that's what should worry us." The desert wind swept across the field, carrying with it the faint metallic creak of cooling armor. The battle at El Guetar had shown the truth. The Sherman was not the best tank, but it was the tank that never stopped coming. And in a war of steel, numbers, and endurance, that would soon matter more than anything else. Rain fell softly over the Italian countryside, turning the roads to rivers of mud and filling the shell holes with murky water. The thunder of artillery echoed through the valleys, rolling off the distant mountains like an endless storm. American tank crews trudged through the muck, their boots sinking deep as they struggled to keep their machines running. The desert heat of Africa had been replaced by cold and rain, and with it came a new kind of war. Sergeant David Miller stood beside his Sherman, its olive-drab hull spattered with mud and ash. The once proud machine looked battered, scarred from weeks of fighting through Sicily and into mainland Italy. The tank's steel sides bore the marks of near misses, blackened streaks, small punctures welded shut, and the faint smell of fuel that never seemed to fade. "Feels like she's falling apart," muttered Private Lucas as he crouched by the tracks, tightening a loose bolt. She's held together by willpower and duct tape, Miller replied. He was only half joking. The Sherman had proven itself in North Africa, fast, reliable, easy to repair. But the battlefields of Italy revealed a darker truth. The hills, towns, and narrow roads made maneuvering nearly impossible. German defenses were stronger here, their guns hidden in stone farmhouses and rocky ridges. Every bend in the road could hide an ambush. And the Americans were learning something terrifying. The Sherman was no match for the 88. The German 88mm gun had become a legend, a weapon feared and whispered about in every Allied camp. Originally built as an anti-aircraft gun, it had been turned into the deadliest anti-tank weapon in Europe. Its shells moved faster, hit harder, and punched through armor as if it were paper. 88, the men called it. The Devil's Nail. Miller's unit had learned its name the hard way. 2 days earlier, they had been advancing through a valley near Salerno when the first shell struck. It hit the lead Sherman from nearly a mile away. The explosion was so powerful that it ripped the turret clean off and sent it spinning into a ditch. The crew never had a chance. Another round followed seconds later, then another. Panic spread through the column as the unseen gun tore into them with mechanical precision. The Shermans fired back blindly, their 75mm shells bouncing off distant stone walls and trees. They couldn't even see the enemy gun. By the time reconnaissance found its position, 6 tanks were burning, their black smoke rising like funeral pyres over the valley. Now, in the rain, Miller couldn't shake the memory. "They say it's got a range of over 2 miles, Lucas said quietly that evening as they huddled under a torn canvas sheet for cover. "Can kill us before we even know it's there." Miller looked into the fire, listening to the rain hiss as it struck the flames. "Yeah," he said softly. "And we can't even reach them unless we get close enough to die trying." A few yards away, another Sherman crew sat beside their tank, whispering to each other. The talk was always the same. The armor was too thin, the engine caught fire too easily, and when hit, the Sherman turned into a death trap. Some called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. Others called it the Tommy Cooker, borrowing the grim nickname used by the Germans. The truth hurt because it was real. When an armor-piercing shell hit the Sherman's side, it often ignited the ammunition stored inside. Flames raced through the crew compartment in seconds, leaving the men trapped inside a burning coffin. Many learned to open their hatches before battle began, ready to jump out at the first sign of a hit. The next morning, Miller's platoon moved again. The road wound through a small village, its stone walls pockmarked by gunfire. The locals had fled days ago. Only stray dogs and broken carts remained. The rain had stopped, but mist clung to the fields, heavy and white. "Stay sharp," Miller warned. "We're in their hunting ground now." His Sherman rolled forward cautiously. The engine growled. The smell of diesel and cordite hung in the damp air. Every shadow looked like a threat. Then it came, a flash from the tree line ahead. The shell struck the Sherman behind Miller's. The explosion lifted the tank off the ground and hurled debris across the road. Over the radio came desperate voices. "We're hit!" "We're hit!" Fire in the ammo rack. Miller's heart clenched. "Get us behind that wall!" His driver swung the tank hard right, crashing through a stone fence. The crew braced themselves as another 88mm round screamed past, hitting the road where they'd been seconds before. Dirt and rock rained down on the turret. "Can anyone see it?" Miller barked. "Negative," came the reply from another tank. "It's hidden." Miller scanned the ridge through his periscope. Then, Movement. He spotted the faint muzzle flash again, far up the hill near a cluster of trees. He steadied his aim and fired. The shell exploded near the target but missed. The German gun turned its fury toward them. "Back! Reverse now!" Miller shouted. The Sherman jolted backward, treads grinding through the mud. The next 88mm round hit the wall beside them, blowing a hole through it the size of a truck. The concussion made their ears ring. Miller's hands were slick with sweat. He knew they couldn't take another hit. Then, salvation came from above, the roar of Allied fighter bombers. The planes dove through the clouds, releasing their payloads on the ridge. Explosions tore through the tree line, sending fire and dust into the sky. The 88mm went silent. When the smoke cleared, Miller climbed out of his tank. The air stank of burned wood and metal. He could see the twisted wreck of the enemy gun at the top of the hill, a once perfect machine reduced to scrap. But the cost had been heavy. 3 Shermans were gone. Lucas joined him, staring at the wreckage. "So that's the famous 88? "Yeah," Miller said, "and it's not going anywhere." He tried to sound confident, but inside he knew the truth. There would be more, many more. Every hill, every road, every field ahead could hide another. As night fell, the men of the 3rd Armored Division gathered in silence. No one laughed anymore. They had entered this war with pride in their machines, believing they were the best. But the Sherman was showing its limits. It could not outgun or outlast the German armor. It could only outnumber it. And so, new tactics began to form. Crews started learning to flank rather than face German tanks head-on. Infantry worked closer with armor, spotting threats before they struck. Air support became their shield in open ground. The Americans were adapting, one bloody lesson at a time. In a captured farmhouse that night, Miller wrote in his logbook by candlelight. His handwriting trembled slightly from exhaustion. "The Sherman's a good tank if you use it right. But if you treat it like a tiger, it'll get you killed." He closed the book and stared out the window at the dark hills. Lightning flickered on the horizon, followed by the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere up there, another 88mm gun was waiting for its next victim. Miller turned away from the window and blew out the candle. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we move again." Outside, the rain began to fall once more, cold, steady, and merciless, washing the blood from the stones as another day of steel and fear waited to begin. The rain had finally stopped over the Italian hills, leaving behind a damp silence broken only by the rumble of engines and the soft clatter of tools. In the valley below, the remnants of the 3rd Armored Division worked through the night, their camp lit by flickering lanterns and the glow of welding torches. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with the scent of oil, diesel, and scorched paint. Sergeant David Miller crouched beside his Sherman as sparks showered from a mechanic's torch. The tank's side armor was bent inward, where a near miss from an 88mm had struck 2 days before. The crew had been lucky, very lucky. But luck was running thin these days. "How's she looking?" Miller asked. The mechanic, a grim-faced corporal named Harris, wiped his brow with a greasy rag. "She'll live, but she ain't happy. I had to pull parts from 2 wrecks just to patch her up. Half these tanks are running on spare hearts." Miller nodded. "As long as it keeps her moving." That had become their motto, keep her moving. Because they had learned painfully that a stationary Sherman was a dead Sherman. The Italian campaign was grinding and brutal. The terrain was unlike the wide deserts of North Africa. Here, every advance meant climbing narrow roads, weaving through stone villages, and fighting house to house. German armor, artillery, and hidden 80s turned every hill into a trap. The Allies could not rely on brute force anymore. They had to adapt. And so they did. Inside the command tent that evening, maps were spread across a wooden table. Lines marked the advance routes toward Monte Cassino, a fortress-like abbey perched high on a mountain. It was a symbol of German resistance and the next obstacle in the long climb toward Rome. Colonel Parker leaned over the map, tracing the winding roads with his finger. "We've been treating the Shermans like battering rams," he said, voice low but sharp. "That ends now. We can't match the Panthers or Tigers head-on, but we can outmaneuver them. We hit from the sides, from behind. We keep them guessing." He turned to the officers gathered around him, men who had buried too many friends in burned-out tanks. "Your job isn't to win a duel," Parker continued. "Your job is to make sure your men live long enough to fight another day." Miller listened from the back of the tent, arms crossed. The words made sense. They'd already begun to change their habits on the field, flanking, using terrain for cover, coordinating with infantry and artillery before moving in. Every tank crew knew now that survival depended on brains, not just courage. Back at the tank line, the crews practiced new formations. Instead of moving in straight columns, they advanced in staggered lines, giving each Sherman room to maneuver and fire without blocking others. Scouts moved ahead on foot, spotting for concealed guns. The tankers began learning to think like hunters instead of prey. One night, while repairing the main gun mount, Miller overheard two younger tankers whispering nearby. "You hear about Baker's crew?" one said quietly. "Took a hit near Cassino. Caught fire instantly. Only the driver made it out. Yeah. They say the fuel lines run too close to the engine block. Once it sparks, the whole tank goes up." Miller set down his wrench. "That's why we store the ammo low now," he said without looking up. "Under the turret ring, surrounded by water jackets. Cuts down the chance of a fire." The men nodded, half reassured, half terrified. Every new loss taught them another way to stay alive. Every burned tank became a lesson. By dawn, the Shermans rolled forward again. Mist curled between the olive trees as the column advanced toward the front. In the turret, Miller adjusted his goggles and watched the road ahead wind up toward the foothills of Cassino. The landscape was eerily quiet. No gunfire, no movement, only the hum of engines. "Too quiet," Lucas muttered beside him. Miller glanced at the map taped to the side of the turret. "That ridge up there, that's where they'll hit us." Sure enough, the first shell came from the left flank. It wasn't an 88 this time, but a Panzer IV lying in wait behind a stone wall. The shell slammed into the lead Sherman's track, immobilizing it. The crew bailed out as the rest of the tanks pulled to cover. "Flank left," Miller ordered. "2 tanks with me." They swung out wide, using the low ground and trees for cover. The new tactics were drilled into them. Never present a broadside. Keep moving. Attack from an angle. "Target spotted," shouted Lucas. 200 meters. Fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. The shell smashed into the Panzer's side, piercing through and erupting in a cloud of smoke and flame. Cheers broke out over the radio. "Nice shot," someone shouted. Miller's crew didn't celebrate. They knew there were more, and they knew every kill brought the Germans' attention closer. Within minutes, mortar shells began to fall around them. Dirt and rock pelted the armor. One landed so close it rocked the tank on its treads. "Keep moving," Miller yelled. "We're drawing fire for the infantry." That was the other new rule. Tanks and infantry moved as one. The days of rushing forward alone were over. The grunts advanced through the rubble behind the Shermans, covering blind spots and spotting ambushes. Together, they moved like a living machine, slower but deadlier. By midday, the ridge was theirs. Smoke drifted lazily from burning wrecks, and the sound of distant artillery echoed from the mountains. Later, back at camp, Miller sat on the engine deck of his Sherman, boots dangling over the side. He watched as mechanics worked on another tank that had thrown a tread during the battle. Around them, the smell of victory was indistinguishable from the smell of death. "Hell of a fight today," Lucas said, sitting beside him. Miller nodded. "We're getting better." Lucas gave a tired grin. "You mean less bad?" Miller smirked. "That too." He looked across the camp at the rows of Shermans lined up under the fading sun. Each one told a story. Bullet scars, welded plates, patched holes. They weren't perfect machines, but they were alive. They were survivors, just like the men who drove them. A British officer passed by, nodding at Miller. "You Yanks are learning fast," he said. "Took us years to figure some of those tricks in the desert." Miller replied, "Guess we're quick learners when dying's the alternative." That night, the crews gathered around a campfire. The laughter was faint, cautious, a fragile thing, growing back after too many losses. They traded tips and stories. How to spot a panther before it saw you. How to use smoke shells to escape. How to listen for the shriek of an incoming 88 and know whether to duck or pray. No manuals taught these things. The lessons were written in blood, metal, and memory. Before turning in, Miller looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds. Somewhere out there, across the continent, the Germans were preparing their next stand. Stronger tanks, thicker armor, new weapons. He clenched his jaw. "We'll be ready," he whispered. Because now, the Americans no longer believed in the Sherman as a miracle weapon. They believed in themselves, in the men who made it work, who turned its weaknesses into strength. The war was changing, and so were they. And soon the Sherman would no longer be a symbol of fragility, but of something far more dangerous, unstoppable momentum. In the winter of 1943, while the battlefields of Europe froze under gray skies, something extraordinary was happening across the Atlantic. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, the heartbeat of American industry thundered like a war drum. The United States was building not just tanks, but an army of machines. Steel beasts rolling out of factories faster than any army in history could destroy them. Assembly lines once used for automobiles now churned out M4 Shermans in endless streams. Sparks rained from welding torches, engines roared through test runs, and the air smelled of oil and determination. Each tank carried more than just metal. It carried a piece of America's will. Workers painted names like Detroit Belle, Rosie's Revenge, or Liberty Jane across the olive-drab armor before shipping them off to war. For the first time, factory workers felt they were part of the front line. Every rivet, every bolt, every tightened screw was a blow against tyranny. Meanwhile, on the German side, the story was far different. Panther and Tiger tanks were marvels of engineering, powerful, deadly, and precise. But they were nightmares to build and maintain. German factories, often under Allied bombardment, could produce only a fraction of what the Americans could. Each Panther took nearly twice as long to construct as a Sherman, and spare parts were growing scarce. While German engineers debated perfection, the Allies embraced practicality. By the beginning of 1944, more than 40,000 Shermans had been built. They rolled from ports in New York and Boston, packed into Liberty ships bound for England, North Africa, and Italy. It was a logistical miracle. Trains, trucks, and cranes moved with clockwork precision, loading and unloading steel giants that would soon roll into history. In England, the vast southern countryside became a sea of Shermans, rows upon rows of tanks stretched across meadows and airfields. Their gun barrels pointed toward France. American soldiers, often young and green, trained tirelessly, learning to maneuver in tight columns, to repair engines under pressure, and to fight as one unit. Commanders taught them something that had become the Sherman's greatest advantage: coordination. The Sherman was never meant to fight alone. One-on-one, it could rarely stand against a Panther or Tiger. But 5 or 10 Shermans working together could overwhelm even the most feared German armor. The strategy was simple but effective: mobility, communication, and numbers. If one Sherman fell, another flanked. If the enemy's 88mm gun roared, the others fired from cover. In a briefing room somewhere in southern England, an officer pointed to a map covered in arrows. "Gentlemen," he said, "our tanks might not be the strongest, but they'll be everywhere. The Germans can't shoot what they can't keep up with." The men laughed quietly, some nervously, some with pride. The mockery that once stung, that their tanks were weak or soft, was beginning to fade. There was power in numbers, and they knew it. Back in Germany, tank crews noticed something unsettling. Reports from the Eastern Front told of American tanks appearing in growing numbers alongside British forces. A German captain near Anzio wrote in his journal, "For every Panzer we lose, they replace 5. Their tanks are not as good, but they never stop coming." By the time spring 1944 arrived, the Allies had mastered the art of replacement. When a Sherman was destroyed, another rolled off the docks within days. When an engine failed, spare parts were already waiting at the nearest depot. Crews could repair their tanks in the field using interchangeable components, a concept the Germans, with their complex designs, could only envy. But what truly shifted the balance was morale. American soldiers began to believe in their machine. They knew it was not invincible, but it was dependable. The engine started in the cold. The turret turned smoothly. It didn't break down in mud or freeze in winter. When they needed it most, the Sherman worked. In one dusty repair yard outside Naples, a young mechanic named Joe Sanders wiped grease from his hands and smiled at the sight of another Sherman being rolled out after a full rebuild. "She's ugly," he said, "but she never quits." The nearby tank crew nodded in agreement. For them, survival depended not on perfection, but on persistence. The Germans, on the other hand, were drowning in complexity. The Panther's engine overheated. The Tiger's transmission broke under its own weight. Many tanks were abandoned not from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure. The Allies didn't need to outgun the Germans. They simply outlasted them. By mid-1944, the invasion of France was imminent. Shermans lined the docks of southern England like soldiers awaiting their call. Mechanics checked treads, refueled engines, and secured supplies. Crews packed rations, letters, and lucky charms inside cramped interiors. The air buzzed with tension and excitement. One night, under a dim moonlight, 2 tank commanders sat beside their Shermans, smoking cigarettes. "You think these tin cans can handle the Panthers?" one asked. The other grinned. "Maybe not one-on-one," he said, exhaling smoke. "But I'll bet you they can't stop 100 of us." That confidence was new. It wasn't arrogance, but resolve. A quiet faith in the machine that had carried them this far. The Sherman had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of unstoppable production, teamwork, and endurance. When the engines finally roared to life on the morning of June 6, 1944, the flood of iron surged forward. Shermans rumbled onto landing craft, waves slapping against their sides. Crews braced for what awaited them on the beaches of Normandy. Many knew they might not survive the day, but they also knew that behind them stood thousands more, ready to take their place if they fell. From the air, the sight was overwhelming. Rows of tanks stretching as far as the eye could see, each one part of a tide that no army could hold back forever. The mockery of earlier years was gone. The laughter had faded into silence as the landing ships approached the French coast and the thunder of artillery filled the air. One sergeant inside his Sherman whispered to his crew, "This is it, boys. Let's show them what a flood looks like." The ramp dropped, seawater rushed in, and the engines roared forward into history. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. The dawn sky over the English Channel was streaked with gray clouds and gunfire flashes. Thousands of ships pushed through rough waves, their decks packed with soldiers, jeeps, and tanks. Among them, the M4 Shermans waited below deck. Engines rumbling, crews silent. The men could hear the distant thunder of naval guns pounding the beaches ahead. Every vibration through the hull felt like the pulse of fate. Inside one of those landing craft sat Sergeant Bill Harlow and his crew. They had named their Sherman Lucky Lady, though luck had been hard to come by lately. The tank rocked violently as the waves slammed against the ramp. "When this door opens," Harlow muttered to his gunner, "we roll fast and we don't stop. You see smoke, you drive through it. You see a hole, you drive around it. But whatever you do, don't stop." The ramp dropped with a crash. Water rushed in. The Sherman's treads churned and the tank lurched forward, splashing into chaos. Bullets hissed off the armor like rain on tin. The men inside could barely see through the periscope, only flashes of sand, smoke, and wreckage. Around them, other Shermans weren't as lucky. Some sank before reaching shore. Others were hit by mines or heavy artillery. D-Day was supposed to be a triumph of coordination. But in those first hours, it was survival. The Sherman's engines screamed as they climbed over the seawall. Engineers cleared obstacles while infantry followed in the tank's tracks. Slowly, painfully, the Allied beachhead began to expand. By the afternoon, Harlow's crew had reached the dunes. "We're in, sir," his driver shouted. The sergeant exhaled deeply, hands trembling. Around them, dozens of Shermans sat damaged or burning. But hundreds more were still landing. Reinforcements poured in. The flood of iron that had begun in America was now spilling across Normandy. The first few days were chaos. The hedgerow country of France, known as the Bocage, was unlike anything the Allied crews had trained for. Thick earthen banks topped with tangled brush and trees divided the farmland into countless small fields. To the Germans, it was perfect defensive ground. They hid their Panthers, anti-tank guns, and infantry in the shadows of the hedgerows, invisible until it was too late. For the Sherman crews, it was a nightmare. The narrow lanes made maneuvering almost impossible. Visibility was nearly zero. Every corner could be a trap. A single German gun could destroy an entire column before it was spotted. The sound of an 88mm shell tearing through armor haunted every tank crew's dreams. After one devastating ambush near Saint-Lô, American commanders realized the old tactics wouldn't work. "We're not fighting in open desert anymore," one colonel said grimly. "This isn't Africa. This is a maze adaptation became survival." Within days, the crews and engineers began improvising. They welded sharpened steel prongs to the front of their Shermans, creating the now famous Rhino tanks, capable of plowing straight through hedgerows instead of trying to go around them. Suddenly, the tanks could burst into German-held fields without warning, surprising defenders who thought they were safe. Teamwork became the key. Tank units learned to fight in harmony with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Shermans moved with infantry close behind, ready to root out German soldiers armed with Panzerfausts. When a tank was hit, others used smoke shells to cover the evacuation. Crews communicated constantly, shouting over the roar of engines, signaling with flags, or using radios that crackled with static and tension. By mid-June, something began to change. The Shermans that had struggled through the sand now maneuvered confidently through the bocage. Commanders coordinated entire armored thrusts with precision. When one road was blocked, the tanks simply cut through walls, pushing into the next field like bulldozers. Slowly, methodically, they drove the Germans back. In one battle near Carentan, a group of 5 Shermans faced off against 2 Panthers hidden behind a farmhouse. The German tanks fired first, destroying the lead Sherman instantly. But instead of retreating, the others flanked. One drew fire while the others circled around the hedgerow. Within minutes, they struck from behind, knocking out both Panthers. It was a brutal lesson in teamwork, and it worked. The German crews, once confident, began to feel the strain. Their tanks were stronger, yes. But every destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced, and every village lost took a piece of their morale. "They keep coming," one captured panzer gunner told an American officer. "No matter how many we kill, there are always more." By late July, the Allies were preparing for Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. Thousands of Shermans lined up along the narrow roads, engines idling, dust rising into the summer air. The men inside knew what was coming. The sky filled with bombers that pounded the German lines for hours, shaking the earth like thunder. Then, as the smoke cleared, the Shermans advanced. It was no longer a slow crawl through hedgerows. It was an avalanche. The American tanks moved fast, smashing through weakened defenses. Entire panzer battalions were caught off guard, their lines collapsing under relentless pressure. The once invincible Panthers found themselves isolated, outflanked, and overwhelmed. Captain James Porter, commanding a Sherman unit during Cobra, recalled the feeling years later. "It wasn't about who had the better tank anymore. It was about momentum. Once we broke through, nothing could stop us. We didn't fight the war one tank at a time. We fought it with everything: air, armor, infantry, supply." That was the real power of the Sherman. The German command was stunned. They had underestimated the Allies' ability to adapt, to coordinate, to push forward no matter the losses. In villages like Saint-Lô and Avranches, Sherman columns thundered through streets still choked with rubble. Children peeked from windows, watching the olive-drab tanks roll past, symbols of liberation and unstoppable force. For the crews inside, it was a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. They had endured fire, fear, and loss, yet they kept moving. One tank commander, looking over a field of wrecked armor after the breakout, said quietly, "We were called weak once, but I don't see them laughing anymore." As the Shermans rolled out of Normandy and into open country, their true strength revealed itself. The tank's reliability, numbers, and flexibility had turned the tide. The once clumsy machines of D-Day had become the spearhead of a new, relentless advance, an iron tide sweeping across France. By August, German forces were in full retreat toward the Seine River. The Allied armies had pierced the heart of Normandy. The laughter that had once echoed in German barracks had been replaced by silence, disbelief, and fear. The legend of the weak Sherman was dying. buried beneath the treads of thousands of tanks that refused to stop. As dusk fell over the smoking countryside, Sergeant Harlow sat atop his battered Sherman, looking west toward the setting sun. "Guess she's not such a bad lady after all," he said softly, patting the scorched armor of Lucky Lady. His crew chuckled wearily. They were alive, and they had done their part. The tide had turned. The flood that began in American factories now roared across Europe, unstoppable and unending. August 1944. The summer air in northern France hung thick with smoke and dust. The thunder of artillery rolled endlessly across the hills, echoing through the valleys of Normandy. After weeks of relentless fighting, the German army was breaking. The mighty Panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now retreating in chaos, fleeing east toward the River Seine. Their goal was simple: escape the tightening jaws of the Allied advance. But the Allies had other plans. The encirclement began quietly. American and British forces pressed in from the west, while Canadian and Polish troops closed from the north. The French resistance, emboldened by the liberation of nearby towns, harassed German convoys from behind. Trapped between them was the German 7th Army and remnants of the 5th Panzer Army. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, and what was left of the once proud armored divisions. For the Sherman crews advancing on the southern flank, the order was clear: seal the pocket. They moved through shattered villages and open fields littered with the wreckage of war. Burnt-out Panthers and smoldering half-tracks lined the roads. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and death clung to everything. Sergeant Bill Harlow and his crew in Lucky Lady had been fighting almost non-stop since Normandy. Their tank's olive paint was now streaked with soot and mud, its armor scarred by near misses. "You can feel it," Harlow said to his gunner, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. "They're running scared." His gunner, Corporal Davis, nodded. "Let's make sure they keep running, right into the trap." The Germans knew they were surrounded. Radio transmissions crackled with desperate orders. "Break east. Find a gap. Save the armor." But the roads were jammed with vehicles, horses, and men on foot. Allied fighter bombers prowled overhead, strafing anything that moved. The once disciplined retreat turned into a stampede. In the fields near the town of Chambois, a column of Panthers tried to fight their way through. They set up defensive lines, their long 75mm guns scanning for movement. The first Sherman that appeared was hit instantly, flames shooting into the sky. But the Shermans kept coming, 3 more advancing under cover of smoke, firing as they moved. The battle that followed was pure chaos. Shells tore through hedgerows, and the ground shook under the impact of explosions. Harlow's Lucky Lady fired twice, knocking out a German half-track before ducking behind a rise. "Driver, swing left," he ordered. "We'll flank them through that orchard." As the Sherman crashed through the trees, the crew could hear the distant roar of engines and the metallic scream of tank tracks. They emerged on the Panther's side, close enough to see the German crew scrambling to reload. Harlow didn't hesitate. "Fire!" The 75mm gun barked, the recoil slamming through the tank. The Panther erupted in a plume of black smoke. The men inside the Sherman cheered briefly before realizing there were more targets ahead. For hours, the battle raged. The Allies tightened their grip around the shrinking pocket. Sherman units coordinated with British Cromwells and Canadian Fireflies. Tanks modified with powerful 17-pounder guns capable of piercing even a tiger's armor. Artillery hammered the roads. The sky buzzed with Allied planes diving again and again, cutting off any chance of escape. By August 19th, the pocket was nearly closed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped. Allied forces from the north and south were now only a few miles apart. In that small gap, chaos ruled. German officers screamed orders that no one could hear over the explosions. Vehicles collided, horses panicked, and columns burned where they stood. The retreat had become a slaughter. One German tanker, later captured, described the scene with haunted eyes. "We had no air cover, no fuel, no ammunition. We were surrounded by fire. The sky was full of enemy planes, and the ground shook with their tanks. Everywhere you looked, there were Shermans. Always more Shermans." By August 20th, the jaws snapped shut near Chambois. The Americans and Poles linked up, cutting off the last escape route. The trap was complete. The Falaise pocket was closed. Inside, an estimated 50,000 German soldiers were trapped, and thousands of vehicles lay wrecked. Allied tanks and infantry moved systematically, clearing the area field by field. The once proud Panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe were reduced to smoldering ruins. Harlow's crew advanced cautiously along a road lined with destruction. Burnt Panthers lay in the ditches, their hulking frames twisted by explosions. Abandoned rifles and helmets littered the fields. Smoke hung low over the landscape, turning the afternoon sun blood red. "God," murmured Davis, staring at the wreckage. "It's like a graveyard for steel." Harlow nodded grimly. "That's exactly what it is." The men were silent as they passed the wrecks. Tanks that had once been feared symbols of German might, now rusting monuments to arrogance. The laughter that once mocked the Sherman had died here, buried under tons of twisted metal. Later that evening, as the Allies secured the pocket, the reality of victory began to sink in. The German army in France had been shattered. Without its armor, the road to Paris was open. The Panzer divisions that survived were in full retreat, their strength broken beyond repair. In a field outside Troon, Allied soldiers gathered around their tanks, too exhausted to celebrate. Smoke drifted in the distance, and the horizon glowed faintly from fires still burning in the pocket. A British commander walked past a line of Shermans, pausing to rest his hand on one. "You've earned your place in history, old girl," he said softly. For the crews who had survived, the victory was bittersweet. They had seen too much. Friends lost, tanks destroyed, lives shattered. But they also understood what it meant. The myth of German invincibility was gone. The Panther and the Tiger were no longer monsters to be feared, but trophies of a dying army. In his after-action report, Harlow wrote, "We were told we'd be outgunned and outmatched. Maybe we were, but we never stopped coming. And in the end, that's what broke them. Not our strength, but our persistence." The fields of Falaise stood silent in the days that followed. Dead soldiers and burned-out tanks covered the ground for miles. Locals called it the corridor of death. Even years later, farmers would still find fragments of armor buried beneath the soil. The flood of Shermans that had begun on factory floors in Detroit and Chicago had now washed over Normandy and crushed the heart of the German defense. The laughter of early war years was gone forever, replaced by a grim respect, even among those who had once mocked the tank. As night fell, the Shermans stood in long, dark rows, their engines cooling, their crews resting at last. Above them, the stars shone faintly through drifting smoke. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned so decisively that the end was now only a matter of time. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had turned into a slow-motion collapse for the once dominant German war machine. Town by town, field by field, the Reich was shrinking under the relentless advance of Allied armies. What had begun years earlier as lightning warfare, fast, decisive, and full of swagger, had become a grim grind of exhaustion and ruin. The ground that once echoed with the proud roar of engines was now silent, littered with burned-out husks of metal. An iron graveyard stretching from the forests of the Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin. Among the wrecks lay the Sherman and the Panther, the Tiger and the Panzer IV, machines that had faced one another countless times in fields of mud, fire, and death. Their stories were written not in victory parades or propaganda reels, but in the rusting shells left behind. To walk through one of those battlefields after the fighting stopped was to see the full cost of mechanized war. Towers blown clean off their hulls, tracks twisted like melted ribbon, guns pointing aimlessly toward the gray sky. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed these beasts, leaving behind the bones of an industrial age. For the men who survived, it was a haunting sight. Private Jack Harris, a Sherman driver from the 3rd Armored Division, remembered rolling past the ruins outside Cologne. His tank, Lucky Lady, had survived 3 direct hits that never penetrated. A miracle, he thought, given how many of his friends hadn't been so fortunate. On both sides of the road, German tanks lay gutted, their engines melted by napalm and shells. Some had burned so hot the steel was warped like clay. They looked invincible once, he said years later. Now they looked like coffins. The Sherman had earned many nicknames over the years, some flattering, some not. Ronson, the Germans called it at first, mocking how easily it burned. American soldiers grimly echoed the joke, saying it lights up every time. But as the war drew to its brutal close, those same Shermans were everywhere. They had crossed the deserts of Africa, climbed the mountains of Italy, burst through Normandy's hedgerows, and now thundered down the autobahns toward Berlin. For every Sherman lost, another had taken its place, and another after that. The sheer industrial power of the United States had buried the myth of German superiority beneath mountains of steel. On the German side, the story was much darker. Panzer crews, once the elite of the Wehrmacht, fought on with bravery and desperation. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly out of fuel. The vaunted Panthers and Tigers, masterpieces of engineering, often broke down before they could even reach the front. Some had to be abandoned, their crews setting charges inside to destroy them before capture. A few were so short on gasoline that they were hidden in barns or forests, waiting for a battle that never came. For those who had once laughed at the Sherman's simplicity, it was a cruel irony. The tank they had mocked was still running, while their own machines sat silent. By March, Allied reconnaissance photos showed long trails of wrecked armor stretching across Germany. Panthers burnt out on bridges, Tigers half sunk in the mud, Shermans toppled into shell craters. The battlefields looked less like scenes of victory and more like scrapyards for titans. War correspondents called it the Iron Harvest. Soldiers, exhausted and numb, called it something else: the end. As the Allies pushed deeper, they began to see signs of how total the destruction had become. In towns like Aachen, Nuremberg, and Kassel, tank carcasses were piled in intersections, blocking the way. Mechanics scavenged whatever parts they could. Steel was twisted and melted. The smell of oil and death lingered in the air. To the young men who had spent years inside these machines, the sight was almost human, as if their comrades in arms had fallen beside them. The tanks had personalities, quirks, tempers. Losing one felt like losing a friend. For many crews, the end of the war didn't bring celebration. It brought silence. They had lived inside steel coffins for years, breathing fumes, sleeping under bombardment, never knowing if the next hit would be the last. The laughter that once echoed through the Shermans' cramped hulls was gone, replaced by weary reflection. "We didn't win because our tank was the best," said Sergeant William Red McAllister. "We won because it was good enough, and there were enough of us left to fight." The Shermans' legacy, forged in those final months, was complicated. It was not the strongest, nor the heaviest, nor the most fearsome. It was, however, reliable. It could be repaired quickly, shipped easily, and driven by crews with just weeks of training. It became the ultimate soldier's tank, not a marvel of engineering, but a tool that worked when it mattered most. And in the long run, that was what won wars. Historians would later argue over which tank was truly superior, the Panther with its deadly gun and thick sloped armor, or the Sherman with its speed, reliability, and numbers. But for the men who fought inside them, superiority was measured in survival. The Sherman's crews learned to fight smarter, using teamwork, flanking tactics, and overwhelming coordination with air support. They adapted. They endured. By war's end, even German officers admitted grudging respect for the inferior tank that had never stopped coming. In the ruins of Germany, Allied troops began collecting the remains of the battlefield. Thousands of wrecks were scrapped, melted down, and turned into peacetime steel. Yet some were left where they fell, silent memorials to a generation of men and machines that had shaped history. Tourists would later visit those sites, taking photographs beside rusting armor, never fully understanding what those machines had meant to the men who lived and died inside them. One evening, as the sun set over the Rhine, an American unit parked their Shermans beside a destroyed Panther. The war was almost over. The air was quiet except for birds returning to the fields. One of the men climbed onto the Panther's turret and traced his hand across its scorched surface. "Hell of a machine," he said softly. His commander nodded. "Yeah," he replied, "but ours got us home." That was the truth of the Sherman, not invincible but faithful, not perfect but persistent. It rolled across continents, through deserts and cities and forests, carrying ordinary men into extraordinary moments of courage and loss. It was a machine that reflected its makers, imperfect, underestimated, and yet unstoppable when pushed to its limit. As the last battles ended and the guns went silent, Europe's fields remained filled with the ghosts of those machines, the iron graveyard of a mechanized war. And in that silence, the laughter that once mocked the Sherman had finally faded, buried beneath the rumble of 1,000 engines that refused to die. Because in the end, victory did not belong to the strongest tank. It belonged to the one that never stopped moving.